The world is waking up, and you finding your way here today is no coincidence. The spirit world always has a way of guiding us where we most need to be at the absolute perfect time. I'm your host, Lindsay Morlock, and you're listening to the Guided Podcast, where we explore how the spirit world works on our behalf to guide us along our paths. This is where you'll learn how to live a life that is both conscious and connected, so you can supercharge your pathway to healing and open to life's magic and miracles. Come along this journey to see how guided you truly are. Hello, and welcome to the Guided Podcast. One of the things you will hear discussed repeatedly on this pod are stories of spiritual awakenings. I personally love hearing about those moments, both big and small, or the sequencing and unfolding of events throughout people's lives that serve as a catalyst for their own awakenings. And part of the reason I love these stories so much is because there's so much variation. None of us awaken in the same way. Some of us might find similarities in each other's stories, but truly no two stories are ever the same. And it feels important to acknowledge that because many of us look to one another to compare our stories. And while we certainly find resonance with one another in different ways, it's important to understand that the spirit world knows how to get you where you most want to be, the most prepared you can possibly be for the journey. So it's going to look different for each one of us for that reason alone. So it seems only fitting that I officially kick off the Guided Podcast with my own awakening story and share with you about my own journey and how my awakening brought me into my own guided life. And as I reflect on my own story, a quote from Steve Jobs always enters my mind. In referencing life, he said, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever." And I've always loved this quote because it's so true for me as I look back on my own awakening. When it was all happening and unfolding, the awakening felt so small, I wouldn't have even considered it an awakening, honestly. It felt more like a series of little moments where I would notice a feeling that left me feeling intrigued or hopeful or curious or expansive. Little moments where I might be able to connect to a moment of stillness within my body that felt like peace and a knowing that felt like it was leading me somewhere to a deeper understanding or down a path, even if I couldn't really clearly see where I was headed. But the one element for me that has always been present in my life is that I've always been a seeker. I've always been a seeker of meaning, the meaning of life, of why things happen the way they do, of, why I feel or felt the ways or the things that I felt in my life. And this search really served as a constant catalyst for my own journey's unfolding. It propelled me to search for answers in books, in conversations with friends, in psychological or metaphysical practitioners and healers, from medical and holistic physicians, and most recently from my own spiritual support team of guides, angels, and ancestors who really help me every moment of every day. I'm sure you've heard stories from people who have had a sudden spiritual awakening. In fact, if you move ahead to the next episode entitled Soul Wisdom with Tina and Oliver, you're going to find that Tina's awakening story really falls into that category. In my case, however, my awakening unfolded slowly over time for many years, with periods of greater acceleration in more recent years. So I like to think of my story as kind of the Hansel and Gretel of spiritual awakenings, where a series of following the breadcrumb moments, sometimes finding myself trapped, but ultimately finding my way to freedom more and more as life continues. So a little about me. I grew up in northern New Jersey, about 30 miles west of New York City, and I'm the youngest of 3 kids from a 2-parent household. And I had a privileged upbringing by most any definition. I lived in a small but affluent town with a competitive school district and all the pressures that you might imagine that accompany growing up in that kind of fishbowl. And while I wouldn't consider my family to be heavily religious, my mom and I did frequent church pretty regularly when I was growing up. So I was confirmed into to the Episcopal Church. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Episcopalian way, people joke about it as being quote unquote Catholic light, meaning the religions are very similar, but without many of the supposed rules that you might find in Catholicism. For example, priests can get married, women can be priests, things like that. But I think because I grew up with these loose beliefs around religion and the rules were more fluid, unlike some people's experiences with religion, I never felt tethered or attached to any particular belief system within the church. It was simply something that offered me peace and comfort for an hour each week. And as a kid, I think I was somewhat of a rare bird in that I actually liked going to church. And it wasn't that I cared so much about the scripture or Sunday school or diving deeply into the religious teachings, because if you were to ask me about any of that now, I would not be able to tell you much of anything. But I can remember contemplating life as a priest as a future career, being able to counsel people and support people in their times of struggle. It was always appealing to me. The topic of death and dying was always interesting to me for some reason. And I remember one time overhearing my mom comment to another parishioner that church seemed to have a different effect on me than she noticed it have on my sisters. And while I didn't know what that meant at the time, I knew it meant something because it always stuck with me, and I had agreed with her opinion, even though I didn't know what to do with it. What I did understand is that it felt really good to give back to people, from creating Easter baskets or buying Christmas presents for kids in challenging situations to making meals for those who might be unable to leave their homes. It felt good to be of service, and that provided an outlet for me to be able to be of service in some of those ways, even if they were very small. I also loved the peace I felt when I would be reciting the rituals during the church services. There was just something about church that grabbed my attention in ways that I noticed my friends could kind of care less about. So I knew there was something different about me in that regard. I always just kind of chalked it up to maybe being a goody two-shoes or something of the like, but looking back, I can see that it was an hour of quiet each week that helped me to still my mind and connect to something greater than myself. And I didn't realize how important that would be along my journey. So my point in telling you this is that I've always been drawn to the concept of God. And today I would consider myself spiritual, not religious. And where that transition into spirituality really began is a direct result of the connection I made with the parents of two kids I used to babysit for throughout high school and college. At the time, I just knew I loved spending time with this family. They were faithful people for sure. They had their own experiences with divine magic and miracles in their own lives. And often after they would come home from an evening out, I would listen to their stories about their own life and the synchronicities that unfolded that led them to believe that there was more to life than meets the eye. And I was captivated by their stories of the unexplainable healing of physical ailments, of an earth angel that came into their life at an important juncture in ways that were so divine and mysterious, they could barely even explain what happened. So deep within me, I had a knowing that this was all real. I just didn't have examples in my own life to prove the existence of it. So one day, this mom told me she had just finished reading a book that she thought I might like, and it was called Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh. Now, if you've ever read this book, it's a conversation between Neil and God, and Neil channels the answers to questions he has about the meaning of life and why things are the way they are here on Earth. So the following week, I went down to the Jersey Shore for vacation. I brought the book with me, and I can remember sitting on the beach, listening to the sounds of the ocean as the sun set, reading this book, and feeling this deep connection to what was written on the page. It felt like truth, and yet no one in my real life spoke about these concepts in this way. God had always been referenced as something outside of me, usually a man that we look to for support and comfort and to guide our lives. But this spoke to a source of power within us, not outside of us. There was a part of me that knew the information I was reading was true, even if I had no tangible evidence of it. So I finished the book and did what any other 16-year-old would do. I considered the teachings for about an hour and then moved on with my life. Now I'm jumping around here a little bit, but part of the reason that book spoke to me so much was because when I was 13, I experienced an incident of physical and sexual trauma that left me suffering in silence and crying out for attention all at once. And while I tried to speak about the incident immediately after it happened, the rejection from some of my peers and the minimization of the event itself I experienced left me feeling ashamed and to blame for what had happened. So I chose the path of mostly silence, not asking for help, and acting out in ways in high school that were screaming for attention. I remember the day my mom got a call from the guidance department about a potential eating disorder that they were noticing with me, and the embarrassment that washed over me when I realized she knew. My strong grades tanked one marking period because I couldn't concentrate. And I can offer other behaviors that I engaged in reflecting the need to overwork, overperform, to overplease, to compensate for these feelings of deep shame that I held around never feeling like I would measure up or be good enough. So instead, to deal with it all, I started eating my feelings to numb the pain that was continuing to grow within me. But asking for help was a sign of weakness at the time, or at least in my opinion. So I adopted the approach that I know so many people can resonate with, which is the suck it up and deal method of getting through life. So back to the book, reading it gave me hope. It gave me perspective, and it planted seeds that there was something more to life than what I was currently experiencing, that the pain I was experiencing might actually be purposeful, and more importantly, that there was a way out of it. And I didn't know how, I just knew it must exist. So that was my first breadcrumb. Now fast forward 4 years later, and I found myself about to enter college and researching first-year seminar courses that were being offered at this institution. I remember reading the seminar brochure immediately, knowing that all courses were assigned on a first-come, first-served basis. And I was raised to be an early bird gets the worm kind of girl, and I just knew I had to be in the Witches of Salem first-year seminar. Now, in hindsight, I realized that may have been a risky choice, but there was only one other course that seemed remotely interesting to me, so I selected the course, held my breath as I mailed it back to the college, just hoping that I would get my first pick. Sure enough, I was enrolled in that class. And in hindsight, it's clear to me why I felt so drawn to it, whether I was remembering my past lives on a cellular level or just drawn to the idea of conjuring up magic. The content of this class had my full attention, and perhaps it was the fact that the rejection that these witches experienced for being who they are deeply resonated with my own experiences. So the very last day of this class, our professor invited a current senior into the class who was a practicing Wiccan. And she explained to us that she read tarot cards and all about how that lineage was passed down to her, how she would meditate on a mountain and meditate on each one of the cards as she was learning to intuit the meanings of them. And I was mesmerized by what she was sharing and remember feeling jealous that she had these gifts, the gift of seeing into the future, because deep down, I wanted that too. I remember reveling in what it must feel like to have constant access to the events that would unfold in your life. Anything that minimized uncertainty in my own life felt like the safest and surest path. So I was all about that. I was always someone who wanted the money back guarantee on life. I wanted things to unfold and play out in very specific ways, but if they weren't going to happen in the way my mind was picturing it, I wanted my money back. And in reality, the way this played out is I prevented myself from taking a lot of risks or having experiences unless I could predict with certainty that they would turn out the way I intended them to. But more on that in a separate podcast. So the allure of being able to eliminate uncertainty from my life was highly appealing. And it seemed like she knew how to do it with these tarot cards. And I wanted to be able to do that too. But I was convinced that you needed to be born with a certain gift to do this. And that just wasn't true. But I didn't know until many years later. So during college, I majored in psychology, I minored in elementary education, and the combination of these two courses of study enabled me to dive deeply into the process of self-reflection and understanding, and really served as a catalyst to seek counseling and beginning to work through my own healing. And while it was a great introduction into understanding myself on a deeper level, people can only help you if you're willing to be fully honest about what is plaguing you. And because I was so so afraid of my experience in being minimized or rejected again, I was selective about the information I was willing to share. So most people perceived me to be someone who had it all together all the time. In fact, recently in discussing some of this with my mom, she shared with me that she never knew how unhappy I'd been. And it makes total sense to me that she would say that, because I went to great length to hide it from just about everyone in my life, except a select few. And the depths of my pain were my burden to carry, in my opinion, no one else's. And so I often struggled and suffered in silence, straddling stories that no one was going to be able to help me in the way I needed it, or that I didn't even deserve the help. And yet there was a part of me that was still desperate to feel better. So I continued seeing a counselor at my undergraduate institution. And when that stopped being helpful, I went on the quest for a different counselor. Yet I kept falling short. I either never felt like I connected with the right person, or they all had similar advice for me, which just never seemed to move the needle. So by the time I went to graduate school, I started working a graduate assistantship off the Violence Against Women Act grant, where I was working with both the Women's Center and Judicial Affairs to adjudicate cases of sexual misconduct on college campuses. And that really forced me to face where I needed more healing in my own life. So luckily, a fast friend in my graduate cohort, a completely divine connection, was the next person to expand my awareness of spirituality. She and her mom were totally into getting psychic readings, and she would share the experiences she had of how this reader helped her in her own life get rid of negative energy, made accurate predictions about her future. And it was another breadcrumb in the form of expansion. So by the time I left graduate school 2 years later and took my first full-time job in Boston, I was working in higher education as a residence hall director. And like most jobs in the student affairs realm, you work hard, you work long hours, and a lot of nights and weekends to accommodate the students' schedules. So while I found working with student leaders to be incredibly fulfilling, my work-life balance was non-existent. Excess in the forms of overworking and binge eating became the best ways for me to bury my pain. So this period of my life became a rock bottom point. I was anxious, I was depressed, and I was in the throes of an eating disorder. Only binge eating was not really recognized or classified at that time as a legitimate issue. So there were little resources available to get help. I charged therapy sessions to a credit card because I couldn't find a therapist that would take my insurance and take new patients. And I was so depressed that I didn't know what I might do to myself if I didn't get help quickly. So the therapist I found was one of the first to validate my pain and gave me hope that there was a way through it. And in working with her, I knew my life needed to change dramatically. And the only way I knew how to make some big changes was by moving back to New Jersey so I could get my life together. I got a new job. I moved in with my parents for a year so I could cash in on their you get 1 year home free after college policy that I had yet to capitalize on. And as soon as I returned home, I started along what would become a 100-pound weight loss journey over the next 18 months. I was eating well, I was exercising emphatically, and as the weight fell off my body, I started feeling better and better about myself. I felt and looked better in my clothes. People were praising me for my dedication and diligence and being so disciplined about the food that went into my mouth. I passed on office birthday cakes and cookies for my carrots and celery sticks. It was excruciating to make the choice each time, but I knew sugar was my gateway drug. It was always better just to not start. And I had more balance with this job, being that it was in a different functional area of higher education. It was in the academic realm. So as I moved my way up the ranks there quickly, on the outside, things were going well in almost every area of my life. And yet I couldn't shake this feeling that I was still empty on the inside. The truth was that no matter how much I changed my outside circumstances, my weight, my job, my living situation, sure, it definitely helped improve my life, absolutely. But happiness is always an inside job. And I had created what I thought would make me happy. And yet I wasn't able to achieve actual happiness because I was looking externally for that happiness. And more importantly, I was always looking outside of myself for my worth, and it just wasn't working. So naturally, I figured it must be because I wasn't in any kind of romantic relationship. I avoided these like the plague in my life. And I was convinced that not only was I inept in this area of my life, but I always managed to find all the evidence I needed to prove that my beliefs about myself and people were true. There's nothing like online dating to remind you why you are perfectly fine being single. That is what I used to tell myself all the time. We will always find evidence in the material world of what our minds believe to be true. It doesn't matter that several years later, I would end up finding a wonderful match online, but you could not convince me of that at the time. When you believe that you're broken or you're one big red flag or are in fear like I was, you're always going to find the evidence you seek to prove your beliefs to be true. And I did that really well, which only caused more heartbreak and hopelessness, honestly. So one day, shortly after one of my shame spirals about ever being able to find a romantic relationship, I happened to get a call from a friend of mine at the time who had just returned from a workshop where she had learned how to read her own hands. She quickly explained to me that you can find your life purpose and your life lessons in your hands. So I was intrigued and feeling desperate for this information for myself. So she said I should come visit her so we could go get our hands read together. Done and done. She knew stuff like this was right up my alley. So a few weekends later, I was on my way to have my hands read. And this is where my awakening started to gain momentum. When I sat down with this reader and she read my hands, she really saw my soul, especially those parts of myself that I knew I worked so hard to hide from other people. It was eerily accurate. The wisdom in my hands validated all the stories I had been telling myself, the stories that spoke of my deep shame, that reflected my low self-worth, and even explained my control freak ways. And she told me that all of these experiences were just the setup for the lessons I had come here to spend my entire lifetime learning about. And I just felt relief, like I wasn't doomed for a certain path of suffering and misery. And I was empowered by the knowing that none of these things I experienced had to perpetuate. In fact, quite the opposite. She explained that they were setting the foundation for my life purpose to actually blossom. It was a totally revolutionary concept for me at the time. She also told me that I was an intuitive, someone who would be a personal growth catalyst for other people. And I was surprised that my deep longing to be a psychic might actually be a truth somewhere within me. Because as far as I knew at that point in time, my intuition seemed non-existent. But I did feel deeply that I was here to help people, and it was validating to trust that possibility for my life. And so this reading was so impactful for me that I decided to get certified in hand analysis myself. After all, there was both a science and an art to reading hands. I could learn hand analysis with my mind, and I didn't need to rely on my intuition to be able to help people. It seemed like the perfect way for me to get into the healing world without feeling like I had to be psychic. And I spent the next 2.5 years getting my own certification in hand analysis and subsequently diving deeply into my own spiritual journey through my hands along the way. Now, ironically, 10 years into this process, my intuition has since completely opened, and my readings are as much intuitive as they are scientific. So the wisdom in my hands needed to unfold in the right timing, but it was all there to begin with. So one of the things about hand analysis is that your fingerprints offer information about your life purpose, a way of being in the world day in and day out. And the more that you align with that way of being, the more joyful and fulfilling life feels. The fingers also give us information about your life lessons, the things that you've come to Earth School to spend your entire lifetime learning about. So through my own hand analysis training, I was diving deeply into my own life's purpose and my life lessons and the things that I've come to this planet to express and share with others and spend my lifetime learning about. And as I moved through this coursework, I was learning more and more about the world of spirituality, around past lives, and diving deeply into my own healing through the process. So it helped me to unlock my consciousness around patterns that were deeply embedded within me, that were preventing me from living the life I wanted to be living. And that knowledge was so powerful because once we have the conscious awareness of why why we're doing the things we do, we get to stand in choice. We get to choose whether we're going to continue playing out these patterns or whether we're going to make a different choice. A choice to align with the highest expression of ourselves, or a choice to continue to align with the fear that holds us back. And so this knowing helped me to depersonalize my experiences so that I didn't feel so victimized by my circumstances. And as a result, I started feeling better and better about my life. I felt more empowered, and I started working with a coach who could help me from a spiritual perspective in ways that traditional therapy didn't seem to address. So slowly, my life started to improve. I began making decisions in support of the life I always wanted to create. I ended up leaving the field of higher education to transition into a new career in corporate America in search of a better work-life balance. And I even purchased my first home. But I was still struggling with my binge eating, couldn't seem to get it under control, and my weight fluctuated significantly by about 50 to 70 pounds at a time. And while I hadn't ever gained back everything I lost, the numbers were moving in the wrong direction, and I felt powerless to control my urges to stuff my face. So I was making myself physically sick, sometimes even to the point of purging to help relieve the pain that I had inflicted on myself. And so I started working with a therapist who specialized in eating disorders, and I committed to healing this once and for all in a way that I hadn't previously decided to do. I even made the choice to sign up for a group therapy program to learn dialectical behavioral techniques, a modality for behavioral change where you learn helpful skills to manage emotions and manage the urges to eat. And I was tracking my food and I was tracking my emotions daily and trying to dive into why my emotional hunger was so out of control and how to resist the temptation to soothe myself with food. My therapist was amazing, and I still consider her to be one of the very best at what she does. And even with that knowing, after 3 years of consistent therapy, I couldn't figure out why I couldn't kick this habit. And she told me I had all the skills I needed to turn this eating disorder around. And yet I felt like I was white knuckling my way through the process. The way I was having to go about managing my urges to eat didn't feel sustainable. It felt like I needed way too much brain power, way too much willpower to prevent myself from binging. And so in those moments, to prevent myself from eating, I had to dig deep, sometimes forcing myself to jump in the shower so that I couldn't actually put anything in my mouth until the urges passed. But often I would find myself in the car on the way to the grocery store when I just didn't have the willpower to say no. Or better yet, just didn't care. And I couldn't see any end in sight to my behavior or to these urges. There's a reason these things are called addictions, but the truth is I was just as addicted to depressive thoughts about myself as I was to the food that I used to manage them. And I reluctantly found myself on antidepressants, a method that helped to take the edge off just enough to help me manage my urges. But I didn't want to be on medication at all, really, no less for the rest of my life. And I'm not for or against medication. I think everybody's got to do what's right for them. But for me, it felt like a Band-Aid. And I wanted a solution. And while I had made progress in therapy, I knew there had to be a better way. I knew there had to be something else that could help me, but I didn't know what it was and I didn't know where to look. But not long after, a friend of mine wanted to take a trip to Sedona. And I had always wanted to visit because I knew that it was a spiritual mecca. So I decided to gift myself with a 4-day spiritual retreat while I was there. And it was the beginning of a whole new life. On that trip and during that retreat, I met my higher self, whose name is Eleanor, who you will be hearing about throughout the course of this podcast. She serves as my primary guide at the moment and helps me with my own healing as well as helps me in my work with helping others. I met my inner child on this retreat. I didn't even know I had an inner child when I met her. But when I did meet her, she crossed her arms and she looked at me with disdain and said to me, "I don't need your love." Oof, that was an eye-opener. And I knew in that moment that I had my work cut out for me. But one of the most important people I met during that retreat was Tina Provenzano, who is a powerful spiritual teacher and practitioner. And you are going to be hearing from her regularly on this podcast. She was the first person I met when I arrived and the last session I had before I left. And when our session was over, I just knew she was the person who was going to help me change my life. And I was right. Tina and her own team of guides taught me spiritual tools, practices, and philosophies that helped me move through my challenges with far more grace and ease than traditional therapy. They helped me to understand that everything in my life was happening for me, not to me. And how I looked at my circumstances is what would be the catalyst for my growth or my stagnation. And as I implemented the teachings, my whole life started to change very quickly. I couldn't even believe how fast things could change, considering the perspective I had had to date of how slowly anything seemed to change. But utilizing spiritual principles as opposed to talk therapy is what really moved the needle for me. And in hindsight, it was because talking about my problems kept me in my head about the problems. And as I've come to learn, our minds are what caused the problems to begin with. And the mind that causes the problems did not have the solutions. So my spiritual self, my higher self, that's where I found the answers, was looking within. But our minds interfere with our intuition. When our minds are on, when our minds are busy, we disconnect from that intuitive part of ourselves. And so part of my journey really required a method to clear these lower level emotions, to help me quiet my mind or get my mind out of the way completely so that I could reconnect with my higher self, so that I could connect with spirit, with source, with the universe. So I learned pranayama breathwork, and I found that it helped me so much with my own alignment that I decided to get certified to do it for others as well. So my journey continued to unfold. The tools, the practices, one continued to build on another. And while I was in the process of working with Tina, she channeled a process that is known as the Divine Family Program, which is a method for healing the wounds of your inner child in a very loving and compassionate way. And as part of this process, I learned how to partner with my own spiritual support team. I learned how to process my emotions and understand the messages that they were offering me. And the byproduct of the process was more peace and balance in my life. It allowed me to understand the source of my own power as the creator of my life, as the creator of my reality. And most importantly, it's now the foundation for the life that I live every single day. And this is now the process that I teach to other people because it helped me bring my dreams to life. And it continues to help me heal my wounds and bring my dreams to life because the work is never done. It's a process, it's an evolution, it's levels and layers of healing. But this process has given me the confidence to know that no matter what life throws my way, I'm always going to move through it. And that doesn't mean that I have it all figured out because I most certainly don't. I'm learning every single day, just like everybody else. But the more I lean into this way of being and into this way of living, the better and better my life gets. Part of this process was learning about how to maintain vibrational alignment, meaning how to achieve a state of balance and a consistent state of feeling good. And there was a period of time in my life when I contemplated honestly whether it was even worth living anymore. I've wrestled with those thoughts at several points in my life, if I'm being totally honest. And there were times when I was so down and in the gutter that I didn't think I had the energy to find my way out of it. And yet somehow, somewhere, the strength found me to keep going. The right people showed up in my life at the exact times I needed them to help me find my way through. Or whether spirit was, working through my friends to support and encourage me, or whether spirit was working through healers or physicians or even my Instagram feed. I was always given exactly what I needed in the moment I needed it to keep me going. So I want people to know that there's always hope. There's a power greater than ourselves guiding us to what we most desire at every point in our life, guiding us through what we most need to heal. Our wounding is never our fault, but it is our responsibility to heal. And it took me what felt like a long time to fumble through all the different things, the different therapies, the different modalities. But for me, the greatest impact and shift in my healing came as a function of working on the relationship with myself in a way that was both conscious and connected to the spiritual realms. I now am shifting patterns faster than ever before. And while I want to be clear that the pace of our healing should not be the goal, we heal in all of these different levels and layers, and that takes time. And our patterns that hold the deepest grooves also take time to change. And working with spirit allows our healing process to unfold in ways that transcend time and space and allow our lives immediate improvement. There's a spiritual teaching that says, what we resist persists. It's not easy to show up and dive into your struggles and do the necessary work to heal yourself. If it were easy, more people would be doing it. But the payoff for doing the work is worth the effort, in my opinion, every single time. I notice my own life just keeps getting better and better. And that doesn't mean that it's free from struggle or challenge, because it's not. Life is full of obstacles. That's why we come to Earth School. But what has changed is how I navigate my way through those obstacles. I no longer fear that anything is going to completely sink me or cripple me. I know I have an arsenal of tools to help me get through whatever challenges life is going to throw my way. And each time I come out the other side, I feel more fortified in my faith, my trust, and in this deep well of strength that I now know resides within me. And I didn't always know that that was there. Abraham Hicks has a saying, "The better it gets, the better it gets." And this has been my experience as well. And as Tina has told me time and again, while this may not always be the easy path, it is most certainly the awesome path. And I couldn't agree more. As I'll be sharing with you throughout this podcast, our lives change when we change. We can't control anyone or anything outside of ourselves. But when we change our inner worlds, our outer worlds also change. And to me, that's the best part. There's power in knowing that the only person you need to focus on healing is yourself. And by taking care of you, there is a massive ripple effect that spreads throughout your sphere of influence and out into the world. So healing ourselves is truly one pathway to healing the world. I mean, think about it. If you uplift someone else and they go and uplift another person, you're putting a positive ripple effect out into the world. But the opposite is also true. If you're projecting your own fear and negativity onto someone else, that's your issue that you've now projected out into the world. That's your wound, also creating a ripple effect. So which ripple effect do you want to have? And don't misunderstand me. It's not about being perfect. It's not about getting it right all the time, because spirit doesn't expect perfection. But imagine a world where you maintain your peace through all the storms of your life. A world where you no longer take anything personally because you've healed the wound, causing your pain and causing you to perceive situations the way that you do. These are just two small examples of how living a guided life can help improve the quality of your own life and the subsequent ripple effect it has on the world. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look around our world right now and feel like things are crazy, because they kind of are. But darkness cannot hold a candle to the light. And that's what you're seeing. The world is waking up. Darkness, corruption, greed, selfishness, it's all coming to the surface for illumination and examination. And while it can be totally overwhelming to understand how we make the world a better place, I rest easy knowing that it starts with me every single day. It starts with me working on myself and devoting myself to my own healing, because the impact of my healing on me has its own important ripple effect in the world. So I hope my awakening story helps to illuminate that no matter where you are in your own life, whether you are in the depths of despair or feeling like your life is good, but maybe even wanting just a little more, give yourself permission to want whatever you want. Go for your dreams. There is always a pathway to your best and highest life, and it can be so much more magical and fun and easier when you allow yourself to tap into your internal guidance system and allow spirit to show you the way. As I'm sure you've gathered from my story, there is nothing that excites me more than talking about spirit and the spiritual realms. And I can't wait to continue to show you all the ways spirit is showing up for you and guiding you in your own life. And it's important to know that anyone can access the spiritual realm. The ways in which you do that are going to vary, but it's important to understand that if you found your way here to this podcast, I have no doubt that spirit is helping you find your way. So that's all for today, everyone. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to chatting with you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the Guided Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be so grateful if you would share it with a friend or even leave me a review so we can ensure that it makes its way into the ears of listeners who need to hear these messages most. Until next time, may you remember how guided you truly are.